70 years after its establishment, RISM is the premier resource for music research. But in the 1950s, the, quote, revision of Eitner, end quote, was neither inevitable nor guaranteed a successful outcome. Coordination between multiple international associations required an unprecedented level of collaboration on what would be an unprecedented undertaking, far surpassing the scope of Eitner's publication. My talk today draws on preliminary research of Richard S. Hill's extensive correspondence with Friedrich Blume, Vladimir Fédorov, and François Lesure to demonstrate the crucial role that Hill and the relationships he fostered occupied in shaping RISM into a reality. This new research illuminates the dynamic, warm, and sometimes cantankerous relationships between Hill and his European counterparts, and chronicles their efforts on issues of procedure, scope, finances, and even sigla designations. The head of reference services in the Library of Congress Music Division, Richard Hill became the inaugural president of the International Association of Music Libraries in 1951, which propelled his involvement with the inventory project. Worked a second ago. Yes. As Hill later summarized, quote, the music librarians had recognized the desirability of a revision of Eitner, and realizing that much of the work would necessarily have to be done on their premises, they offered to collaborate with the International Musicological Society Committee. An element of the IMS felt that its society had established definite prerogatives in the matter and could see no good reason why help was needed from so new a group. Fortunately, other members of the IMS, notably Professor Friedrich Blume, could see that the only proper formula for such an enterprise demanded that the music librarians and musicologists work together. And when UNESCO's International Music Council let it be known that neither organization would qualify singly for a subvention, plans were laid for establishing an international joint committee, end quote. Hill's summary here hints at the friction simmering beneath the surface of a complex bureaucratic effort. Hill may have written that, quote, time has shown that the step was very wise. Since the first meeting of the Joint Committee in 1952, there has not been the slightest indication of friction, end quote. But an earlier draft loses that diplomatic veneer. The librarians had already offered their help on a revision of Eitner to the IMS committee, which, being somewhat jealous of its prerogatives in the matter, was not willing to accept the offer immediately. Indeed, even as early as October 1951, Hill was writing to Fédorov that, quote, it is quite clear that the musicologists have every intention of squeezing us out of the picture, except perhaps for some manual labor, end quote. The years 1951 to 1954 demonstrate in microcosm both these frictions and Hill's burgeoning friendships with Fédorov and Blume. The Inventory Project's Joint Committee met for the first time in January 52, during which the attendees developed the Plan Général. In the months that followed, Hill's correspondence with both Fédorov and Blume illustrates his immediate emphasis on practicality. Hill focused on the how. How would they accomplish the inventory's lofty goals? In a letter to Blume on June 15, 1952, Hill wrote, but underneath it all, my objections arose far less because of any faults that might be found in the plan for the publication itself, but rather because the groundwork for realizing that plan seemed inadequate. What I really meant was the description of what was to be included in the publication could be as elaborate as anyone cared to make it. But until the means for realizing and carrying out that plan had been thought through with equal care and made of matching elaborateness, I was going to be troubled, end quote. Fédorov's frustration with Hill's insistence on revising and reordering the plan was mirrored in a letter dated May 2nd, 1952, where he wrote, quote, and let us come back for the last time, I hope, to this damned plan. There will certainly be time enough to discuss our RISM plan 1,000 times before stating definitively. Its publishing is one of the ways of calling for attention and discussion, end quote. Fédorov reiterated the following year, quote, we have already waited too long. In international things, waiting is worse than death, end quote. Blume had similarly echoed, quote, I know that I shall never see finished what you call Fédorov's dream inventory. But is this an objection? All great achievements in history have been started without anxiously considering whether or not the author or first initiator of a project might live long enough to see it finished. What would be the consequence of limiting our doings to what can be achieved in our lifetime? We would renounce all that is worthwhile. You will possibly say, look at this Blume, a true German. They cannot part with this unpractical idealism. Maybe, but that is how I see things. Hill, although sympathetic, remained adamant. Believe me, I am not simply trying to make things difficult, but neither can I live on faith alone, end quote. To wit, Hill persisted. Well into 1953, he continued with his nitpicking attention to detail, writing to Blume that, quote, practical operation of the project seems so very important to me at this stage of the proceedings that I can't see why it seems completely immaterial to almost everyone else. Possibly I'm crazy, but I hope not, quote. Hill's correspondence likewise illustrates his insistence on making the inventory a truly international endeavor, rather than a primarily European or Western one. In summer 1954, he wrote to Blume, quote, a catalogue of Sammelwerke that includes no collection whatsoever from India, China, Japan, the Philippines, or any country save France, Germany, England, Italy, and Austria is obviously international on a rather limited level, end quote. Echoed in a letter to the full Joint Committee dated September 1954, Hill cynically asked, is the inventory of musical sources to be an international inventory or a European inventory? The important thing is not which policy we choose to follow, but that we realize the implications of that choice, end quote. Transcending these disagreements on the how, Hill, Fédorov, and Blume still forged bonds of friendship and professional respect. Their correspondence is littered with humorous salutations. Hill referred to Fédorov as dear old chap, dear charming oaf, dear brother in sin. Fédorov greeted Hill with dearest Durushka, dear old Dick, and my personal favorite, my own precious rotten crooked president enfin. Blume and Hill greeted one another, if not as with much humor, the decidedly friendly Lieber Hill and Blume, dropping any, quote, false formalities, as they said in some of their correspondence. Hill did know when to move on, at least some of the time. He acknowledged to Blume that, quote, in any case, the importance of getting us all together to discuss our problems and learn what international relations really mean, end quote. Similarly, Blume reminded Hill, a final word on your personal connection with these questions. You wrote me twice you did not think to have a vote on the Joint Committee. Dear Hill, you should know that I cordially welcome your advice and highly appreciate your native good sense. My opinion is, therefore, that you and I are, for good or ill, linked up closely in the business. Even if I did not appreciate your good advice, as I certainly do, I should at all events need it to avoid making incorrigible mistakes, end quote. Mutual trust between Hill, Blume, and Fédorov proved key in fending off one of the earliest attempts to derail their carefully laid plans. In a letter to Hill from August 4th, 1952, Blume recounted several events from the 1952 July IMS Congress in Utrecht. Regardless of any of his own political motivations or goals, Blume clearly felt he could confide in Hill and Fédorov. Blume's remarks are worth quoting at length. Quote, since the Basel meeting in March 1951, I was sure that Jeppesen, as in Knut Jeppesen, disliked the inventory and, in his clandestine manner, endeavored to kill it one way or the other. And if he now shows the air of a heartbroken man, sorry, I don't pity him. On the contrary, he should be gravely reprimanded for having applied to UNESCO for money in favor of a project that was his private wish and not at all a wish of the society he presided. But his was a venomous hobby, a Trojan horse to be smuggled in midst of the fortress of our inventory and meant to unload there the host of tricky Greeks who had to disarm the defenders. Once the cat was out of the bag, I knew that the only way of rescuing the RISM was to eliminate Jeppesen and Göring. For if Jeppesen had remained president and Göring his eagerly and suspiciously defended secretary, we would never have got $1 from Jeppesen for the inventory. If Fédorov makes investigations, and of course this what he knows without saying, Be careful not to rouse a new magician's spell. Smyers is, in his way, much more a master of witchcraft and underhanded magics than was Jeppesen. We must not stir him. He also dislikes the inventory. So, lots of tension. But Hill was not without his own pet projects. Throughout the mid-1950s, he proposed the creation of a microfilm archive. Libraries worldwide would provide microfilm scans of their materials to a national or a central repository from which anyone would be able to order copies. Suffice to say, the plan faced both funding obstacles and resistance from many European institutions before being dropped by 1956. Fédorov, Blume, and others suggested that Americans were the primary users to benefit from such a project, while Hill blamed the failure on their, quote, gatekeeping ways, end quote. Similarly, Hill felt strongly about the creation and use of sigla. He wrote regularly on the topic to both Fédorov and Lesure, insisting that the National Union Catalog sigla be used for American institutions. His irritation with the Library of Congress receiving the WC designation instead of the well-established DLC was palpable. In a letter to Lesure as late as 1959, he wrote, "The other cards are all for pre-1700 stuff, and I only hope that in one way or another I have already reported on some of it to you since otherwise there are going to be a fair number of those nice water closet symbols which you so kindly chose for us," for Mr. Henle to add. When Hill's YAML presidency ended in 1955, his involvement in the inventory project shifted more to the national level. He devoted his efforts to ensuring that American libraries reported their materials, even though he was adamant in his belief that there was very little from the B1 series to report, and fewer still that would be unique holdings. It was only when the inventory faced a significant financial shortfall in the late 1950s that Hill's most crucial role in the project surfaced. Still devoted to its international success, Hill leveraged his relationship with Werner Klapp, former chief assistant librarian at the Library of Congress and now president of the Council on Library Resources. Hill navigated the grant application process, and much of his correspondence from the time centered on uniting the differing perspectives of Klapp, Fédorov, and Blume to ensure a successful outcome. The Council approved 2 grants totaling $24,000, or $238,000 in today's figures, in 1960 and 1961, to YAML on behalf of the International Joint Commission for the Inventory. The 1961 grant was by far the largest conferred to any organization. Throughout that process, Hill prioritized securing funds for the International Secretariat over the American National Committee, funds that were also sorely needed. In a letter from Bill Lichtenwanger to Lesure in early 1961, Lichtenwanger stated, "Whereas Dick had gone ahead and obtained the grant for the international headquarters, which, as your letter indicates, has served as a, quote, shot in the arm, end quote, to your activities, he was just on the verge of applying for the US grant." End quote. Hill's efforts proved vital in securing financial support during the international project's more precarious first decade, and although he died unexpectedly in February 1961, his work paved the way toward the 1964 Ford Foundation grant, which begat more financial success in the years to come. In the brief time I've had this morning, I hope to have shown how the personal connections, despite differing perspectives between Hill, Blume, and Fédorov, charted or helped to chart RISM's present path. Hill may have written to Fédorov in November 1951 that, quote, "Obviously, we have too many cooks, and to get the soup uncurdled again, a letter is hardly adequate. In fact, I hardly know where to start," end quote. But I argue that it is precisely this multiplicity of cooks that allowed RISM to flourish. Indeed, Hill's microfilm archive may have failed, but the digitized scans for thousands of items freely available in the RISM database are a modern fulfillment of that vision. Fédorov's desire for complete tables of contents is coming to fruition in more in one series records. And Blume's penchant to dream big lives on in RISM's continued path to push and expand the breadth and depth of materials reported. These long-term efforts also continue at the Library of Congress, where we have discovered over 5,000 pre-1800 items that were never reported to the A1 and B1 series, including several items not found in RISM at all. Hill pessimistically said to Fédorov that the gargantuan tasks such as these might be completed, quote, perhaps in 50 or 75 years, but that probably means never, end quote. But here we are, 70 years later, and our work continues to thrive. Thank you.